What we're going to do now is because we have, some of you may be aware, some of you are not aware, a new series called Career Paths, which is for kind of vocational language. Not kind of, it is for vocational language. You also, while we're talking about your bags, you also have a copy of several sample units in this leaflet, if you're doing that level, or that kind of work. Do have a look at this. You'll find it hopefully incredibly interesting. For those of you who are working in vocational language, but even for those of you who are not, there are some useful things I'd like to tell you about. If you're not working in vocational language, I still would like you to bear in mind two things. A, you never know. There is increasing call these days across the whole of Europe for more focused language teaching. Whether it is English for occupational purposes or what have you, whether it's English for academic purposes, excuse me, whether it's business people who want to brush up on their English, for example. These are all opportunities that teachers are being asked to deal with increasingly. And I wanted to spend a little while, and I'll try and get it done fast so we get back on time, thinking about it. For those of you who are doing vocational language on a more regular basis, you may want to have a look. There's not a huge amount of literature around when you're looking at teaching English for specific purposes. And in fact, interestingly, and I'll come back to this in just a minute, most of the literature on it was written in the, well, you can see, late 80s and 90s. And one of the arguments I'm going to make over the next few minutes is that the environment has changed since when this was written. But the standard, Dudley Evans and St. John, very, very, it is useful to look at if you want to kind of brush up on your methodology or your ideas connected to teaching it, although they very much focus on the teaching of business English, and I'll get back to that in just a second. Hutchinson and Waters, slightly older, both still in print, both available. I have my copies in my office, so I can't lend them to you, I'm afraid. But all good bookshops, educational publishers will be able to order them. They're both still in print. In fact, they were reprinted last year. So if you're interested, you can get hold of them. I quote from these and from other sources as we go through. And really, it's just, when we're looking at vocational language and this idea of keeping English real, I haven't moved away from that. There's some interesting questions that come up that do affect, and I hope you'll see the connection, not just the ESP classroom, the English for Specific Purposes classroom, but also the general English classroom. There are some ideas here hopefully you'll find useful. But I do want to focus just to begin with on this idea of some of the changes within English for specific purposes. So let's get some of our terminology out of the way. Certainly in the past, when we were looking at English for specific purposes, ESP, which is a subdivision of LSP, language for specific purposes. Very much people were thinking about English for business purposes. Have any of you ever taught English to business people? Any of you been involved in that? Yes, no? They're quite good customers. If you ever get asked to teach a business person, say yes. I'm not from the tax office, you don't have to worry. But if you're, because A, they're usually polite, B, the company is usually paying, not them, so they don't care about the price so much, and C, they quite often miss lessons, but you could still get paid for them as colleague to colleague. One of my favorite years and years ago, I was teaching a very nice businessman. He worked for an international company. He was based in Chalkida, which is one of the largest cities in Greece. But he was a very busy man. And he missed a lot of lessons. But we got paid for all of them. It was so cool, drinking coffee and getting paid. There should be more days like that, ladies and gentlemen. We deserve them. But anyway, the movement at the time, and especially for me, in my experience as well, it was very much business people that we were looking at. These days, it's changing a lot. Increased emphasis on English for occupational and English for vocational is the same kind of thing. Vocational purposes. There are slight differences between them. I'm not going to worry with them now. But the idea of English for occupational or vocational purposes is becoming increasingly popular. And many of you involved in English for specific purposes may well be involved in those areas rather than this. Sadly, these areas tend not to be such high-paying customers, but never mind that now. Okay. Now, what are the changes over the years? And also, this very much affects the general classroom. In the past, let me get this up, ESP was concerned with these areas, as is, to a certain extent, general English as well. The things you had to think about were, let's start here, well, who was learning the language, why were they learning the language, etc. Where were they learning the language, when, blah, 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 what needs did they have with language? As a result of that, what language did I need to teach them? And what methods was I going to use to teach it? This is the idea of needs analysis. We'll come back in just a few minutes. But it was very much just the linguistics. Yes? This is a business person. Business people need to use these expressions. I shall teach them these expressions. And if you think about it in terms of more general English, this is also how we taught general English as well, in slightly more of those domains. It has changed slightly, and I'm hoping this is going to work, in terms of, especially this, what do I teach? These days, not just language, but also I will have to touch on things like culture. You cannot divorce language and culture. And this is the same for general English as well. English as an international language is still used in different places that have different cultural norms. Think of the social linguistics and pragmatics that I just mentioned. Yeah. So these days when you're teaching English for specific purposes, maybe for business people, but not just, we also have to think about where it's going to be used, and also the language culture of the profession, and we'll touch on that in just a few minutes. Also much more these days, this idea of helping our learners learn to learn. One of the things that's been happening with English for specific purposes is it's being taught to younger people. And these younger people, teenagers, in Russian technical schools, you guys, like it's between, what, 14, 15 to 18, is that correct? Those of you working in technical schools? It's around, so these are young people who have not yet learned how to organize their work, how to organize their thinking. They're teenagers. By definition, they don't think. We have to help them do that, and we'll be talking about that just a little bit after I've disappeared for a while. So we have to look at learning to learn skills, organizing as well. It's not these days just a question of teaching some nice phrases from a book. There are other things. If you're teaching business people, for example, people who travel to other cultures. I have to travel, for example, to places like the Middle East and Asia. And there you've got a whole cultural minefield going on that is beyond the linguistic, but equally important to good communication. In the Middle East, you tend to call everybody Mr. or Miss. It's very polite to talk about Miss Arifa, Mr. Mohammed. Yeah, you don't normally just use their first name, like you guys with the patronymic forms. Although you tend to let foreigners off with that. But in Russian, you kind of like the formal use of the patronymic. These things going on. Certainly in Asia, in business cards. You've got to have lots of business cards if you go into Asia to do business. You give business cards to everybody, I think. And even like the waiter in the restaurant, thank you very much, have a business card. It's just the way they work, and they take everything with both hands. You must be aware of this one. If you're given a business card, but from an Asian person, you should never put it in your back pocket. That's just rude. It should be somewhere important, your wallet, your breast pocket, your inside pocket, ladies, maybe in your handbag or something. It should never go where you're going to sit. It's just considered rude. You should take with both hands. You should give with both hands. It's an absolute nightmare. So, other things, even things like how much food to leave on your plate. When I was a kid in England, you're taught you have to eat all your food. Is that what your mum and dad taught you? If you're a guest, you have to finish it. Even if you hate it, and that's why dogs are so useful. In certain countries in Asia, there's a lovely advert based on this. If you finish everything, it looks like you haven't been given enough. So they're going to give you more. So you're supposed to leave a bit on your plate to show that you're full and that you can eat no more. There's a lovely advert made from that with someone eating a snake. And so he keeps finishing it, and then they keep giving him more. And at some point the restaurant door opens and there's like a 6-meter python being chopped up for the next course. It's one of those things. But these days we do look at that. And it's important that we do when we're teaching our learners. And again, in general English, this idea of culture. Do we stand up? Do we sit down? Do we look at people? Do we shake their hands? How does it work in the classroom? Okay? Now, in terms of where vocational language is taught, things do change slightly. The majority of you teaching vocational language will probably be doing informal classrooms in places like technical institutes, technical colleges, etc. This is my experience in Russia. But occasionally, it can change. For example, if you do get involved in teaching business, any of you working in the private sector, you may have to go into the company and actually do it there. Sometimes they ask teachers to come in and actually have lessons there because it's more convenient. You may be having lessons in other places. I can't think of anywhere right now. Maybe at home, in people's houses. So the variables, just to quickly, there are certain things that do change. The length of a course. How long do you have available? If you're working in a technical institute, usually you have the whole academic year. If you're teaching business people in a business environment, maybe they want a quick intensive course. Maybe it's a summer course where you have to teach faster. Who is going to be there? How many of them are there going to be? Is it going to be just the teenagers, as I said, or is it going to be senior management? Have you got the boss of the company learning English? If yes, be careful. Bosses like to be bosses. All right? And the group size makes a difference. You've got 2-3 people, you've got 15, you've got 20. We have to think about this. I said we've already discussed that, where it's going to be taught. Modes of learning. Is it going to be book learning? Is it just going to be video? Is it going to be role play? How are we going to do it? And who's going to be doing it? Is it going to be a formal teacher? Are you going to have help? Is it going to be someone who's experienced in the business? All of these things are variables that we're asked to think about when we, for example, create training material like career paths. And these are things you guys have to think about when you're also doing the teaching. There are basically 2 types of student in vocational language. You have, on this side would be the people many of you are teaching in technical institutes. Okay? So you've got basically someone who is in the process of becoming an expert. So for example, if you're teaching engineering, oh joy. If you're teaching engineering, you may be teaching engineering to students who are learning engineering. On the other side here, we have business people or people who are already experts. Slight differences. These people are learning English as a tool for their training. Maybe to be able to read manuals, maybe to go onto the internet and find out more about engineering or whatever it is they're doing. They don't see yet 100% where they will use English, and I have to help them with that. And they're likely still to be in formal education. On the other side, if you've got your business people, they're already experts in their field. They're business people, they're plumbers, they're whoever they might be. And a lot of call these days for English for plumbers, especially in Poland. By the way, did you know that in England, Polish is now the widest spoken second language? an interesting change I was discussing with Polish colleagues not so long ago. And a lot of those Polish guys in the UK working in areas like plumbing, in building, and these kinds of things, very good reputation as well. People prefer to employ them, not because they're cheap, but because they actually come when they say they will. British plumbers don't do that. They're a breed to themselves. Experts are likely to want English to help further their careers, and they're likely to have finished not just formal education, but many of them higher education. They may be university graduates or graduates from some kind of school. So you do have a different environment in terms of who you're teaching. I'm going to zoom this through. This is very useful advice for those of you who are teaching, for example, in technical institutions, and that is quite a few of you in here. There are what we call needs analysis when you're starting a course, and this is a discussion I've had with many of your colleagues. The kinds of things that need to be decided. Okay? First of all, you have your target situation. Yeah, what language do my learners need? When are they likely to use it? What are they likely to use? This is something that you have to sit and think about. It's also not, it's something you could discuss with your learners, especially if some of them have any experience. Learning situation. What are my learners' strengths and weaknesses as learners? Please do not ignore this stage, because a lot of the people I've spoken to have problems with this. They forget that you're still teaching a language. So learners are going to have weaknesses with things like reading and writing and spelling and all this kind of thing. And you also need to know what your learners already know. Yeah? What have they already covered? What are they familiar with? What linguistics are they already okay with? What level of language do they have? It's not a bad idea, for example, at the beginning of a year, to give a quick test. Just to see, in terms of the grammar, the present tenses or whatever, what tenses are they familiar with? What grammatical structures have they done? What basic vocabulary are they okay with? Yeah? Just see where you are at the beginning of the year, and because this can save a lot of heartache at the beginning of the year. If you find that their level is low, you may need to improve it. Things to think about when you're teaching, once you've got those established. In other words, what do I have to teach? Where are my learners linguists? What strengths and weaknesses do my learners have and where they are already? Do remember that when you're thinking of the language you're teaching in ESP, these are things that you have to think about. What kind of language should my learners be exposed to? And this goes the way of general English as well. What texts are they going to meet? What are they going to be reading? And what are they going to be listening to in their chosen profession as engineers, as mechanics, as business people? What texts will they encounter? Who are they going to be speaking to with their fellow professionals? Yeah. Also, do they have to deal with non-experts? It's one thing to speak to another mechanic. It's another thing to explain to a non-mechanic what the problem is, especially if that person is me. I'm not terribly mechanical. Yeah? So we have to think about what our learners are going to be exposed to, the professional community they're going to belong to, and the non-professional community they may come into contact with. Because in ESP, we often run away with just teaching them to speak to professionals. They also may well need to speak to non-professionals and explain things. And that's an area that we quite often fall down in. Guys, I know it's getting hot. I'm going to get this will be finished in about 5 minutes, and we'll be back on track. The role of the teacher in ESP is very different from the role of the teacher in general English. And I wanted to make that very, very clear. In general English, the teacher is kind of God. It's a nice feeling. In general English, we know everything. We hold the keys to the secrets of the passive voice. We know what all words mean. We can explain everything. In the ESP classroom, we lose that position because I may be an expert English teacher, but I am not an expert mechanic. So for example, I stop being the fountain of all knowledge and start being someone whose job is more facilitating than explaining everything. Because there are certainly going to be times in the ESP environment, in vocational language teaching, where I need my learners to explain things to me. Because they will know things that I don't. And you know what? That's okay. The point is not to pretend I know everything. The point is to use my learners' knowledge, to use their experience in the classroom to help out. Okay? So what is the teacher's responsibility? Certainly learning something about the course subject is a good idea. Learning a little bit, for example, about engineering, maybe seeing where it's used, maybe sitting in on another lesson. If you're working in a technical college, maybe sitting in where they discuss mechanics in Russian, for example. Again, I use mechanics, but replace it with whichever subject you like. Yeah? What kind of things are they looking at? As teacher, I need to plan the course. I need to know what I'm doing across the course, across the lesson, in terms of the input and output. What are they reading? What are they listening to? And how are we making it real for them? Teaching of the relevant language. That is my responsibility in terms of the vocabulary, the grammar, so on and so forth. And ultimately assessing as well. These are my jobs within the classroom. So let's have a quick think about language issues. There's a very big question in ESP. Real text or simplified text? This is a question I'm asked a lot. This is a real text. Don't worry about reading all of it. Certainly in a real text, I stole this from the internet. It's about soil erosion. A fascinating subject I know many of you discuss over coffee with your friends. What's the state of soil erosion? This was stolen from Wikipedia. I do not deny it. I needed a text. And certainly it does bring up, in red, certain vocabulary items connected to soil erosion. Yeah, they're definitely there. The problem is that the text can get incredibly long, and also I have to find ways of explaining all these words and revisiting them and practicing them. Because it's not enough just to go through this text, give a translation of these words, and hope that my learners will pick it up. That is going to be an issue. One of the reasons we suggest, for example, using course material like career paths, I'm going to mention it, is that within the text, it's much easier to control it. Anyone guess what this number represents? 15 to 1. Because we're thinking about texts, vocabulary, working on vocabulary. Anyone? Oh, I wish it was, because it sounds very posh, but I'm afraid it's not. But thank you very much for trying. It's sadder than that. That sounded nice. You mean like specific terms to general English within a text? Would have been a lovely idea. Thank you for thinking of it. This is, according to the research, how many hours of preparation per lesson hour. According to general research, in order to get about an hour's worth of lesson material, how much on average teachers spend preparing? Finding texts, going through for the vocabulary, looking, some of you go, oh yes. Looking at the words, then working out ways to exploit that vocabulary to get learners using the language, etc. Again, this is an average, but it was based on serious research, and I'm going to go along. It was Dudley Evans again, and St. John, and I'll go along with it because they double-checked their sources as well. Even if it's not 15, it's still a lot because you know how much material you get through in an hour. Yeah? So this is from Career Paths, from the series we're looking at, with a similar text. you will see specific vocabulary. The difference being here is A, the text is ready. You didn't have to find it. And B, all of the subject-specific vocabulary is going to go on to be activated through activities that are already there. What I like about career paths is very much that it saves time in terms of preparation and allows more time for teaching and less time for worrying about what you're actually going to do. So it's very similar to the real text. You can see that the words and the phrases there. It's a slightly shorter length, but it is there. And so when if you are working in vocational language, do bear that in mind, that you have something ready-made that you might find useful. Okay, just to kind of, I'm going to edit this on the fly. I've got about 3 or 4 slides left. Please remember, when you're teaching words, obviously you need to teach the specific words that are to do with soil erosion. But remember as well, there are some non-specific vocabulary you need to look at. For example, if I'm writing a scientific paper, they used in the expression urban environments, which means pretty much the same thing as in the city. Now that's my addition, in the city. But when we're looking at writing serious reports, scientific reports, for example, we should use this because it sounds better. So a lot of what you're teaching in vocational language is not just the specific vocabulary, it's the tone that needs to be used when you're teaching language as well. The kind of being more serious or not, depending on what they're writing. But we play about with that in career paths as well, okay? There's a difference between receptive and productive vocabulary. We don't need to speak everything, but we may need to we usually have to understand more than we can actually produce. That's going on there as well. Final couple of questions to bring this to a whole, because I'll do that now. When you're looking at teaching English for specific purposes, do your learners need to be 100% native speaker level? In many cases, thank you, Miss. In many cases, the answer is no. Maybe they only need enough to be able to read useful material for their job. Maybe that's all they ever need to do. Maybe they're never going to speak to people outside Russia, but they need to read trade journals or manuals or explanations or something like this. It may be the case, I don't know. But it's a serious question we have to ask. If it's business people, then yes, the level is going to be higher. Okay? But if it's someone who's involved in a profession that they just need the input, no. Okay? So do be careful when you're looking at vocational language that you're not overreaching. Maybe you don't have to go that far. If you're looking at in tourist business, a waiter or someone like this, if they can get away with the certain functions that they have to fulfill in the restaurant, it's enough. They don't have to be able to discuss politics, the state of the economy, or what have you. If they can, great, but it's not necessary. So please have realistic expectations of your learners. I'm not talking dumbing down. I'm not saying the learners are stupid. I am saying maybe there are better things to focus on than something they don't need. There's a big difference. Please note what I'm saying. Yeah? The things that they don't need. So lots of things like simulated circumstances, and this is the last one I'll give you. Looking at things like not just the language they use, but how they use it. Body language. Eye contact. Cultural issues, please explore those in the classroom as well, especially if you've got learners who will have contact with other people. If you're in the tourist industry, you will speak to real people face to face. So look at issues like how do we stand, how do we look, how do we interact with people. These are very important parts as well, which is why you get these things in career paths, lots of them. Okay? Lots of opportunity to practice the language, and I wanted to mention this here, yeah. This is an interview situation. Status, high and low, yes? Interviewer, interviewee. Look at this. You're an accountant, speak to an accountant. You're both in the same profession, but are you friends? Not necessarily. So playing about with the social side of it, looking at the language. If you are using, if you're teaching vocational language, I'm going to stop on this one. So you want to get ready because it's your turn. Have a look at this, okay? Within the book you'll find, I'm just going to zoom through because we'll get here. There we go, here. This is the kind of thing we're looking at. This is more on agriculture, for example. Lots of text-based stuff, looking at specific language, but making sure as well that our learners also get the opportunity to act things out, to look at simulated situations. Very important part of what we do. Okay, so you got that. This one is about engineering. Lovely pictures as well. This one is information technology. And the last one is about tourism. Okay, and things like this. Okay.